We've heard from Walden by Henry Thoreau that there may be diverse human lives, and thus diverse good lives. Also in Walden, we've heard the proposal that there are diverse intellectual activities, and that the intellectual life may be composed of diverse intellectual activities, like scientific observation, as well as contemplating. These ideas are supported by Transcendental Wild Oats, a document by Louisa May Alcott. The pilgrims of Louisa May Alcott's story pursue their version of an intellectual life. They're committed to spiritual faith and contemplating and book learning and philosophy, but not so much scientific observation. In Transcendental Wild Oats, Louisa May Alcott provides her observations as a 10-year-old girl of this attempt at intellectual life, and she also provides objections. We're interested in her objections. Let's first hear the Fruitland story, and then we'll hear Louisa May Alcott's objections to the intellectual life, and then let's summarize some hints about Louisa May Alcott's own proposals for the good life. First, the Fruitland story. The document we've read was published in 1873. Louisa May would have been about 40 years old. However, it is a record of events that took place in 1843, which is about 2 years before Henry Thoreau's Walden experiment. So Fruitlands took place before Walden. Louisa May Alcott refers to the characters of her story as pilgrims and pioneers, and their mission is to start a cooperative farm in the countryside of Massachusetts. Fruitlands is their name for this farming community. We learn that the party is composed of her family, which is her father. She calls her father Abel Lamb, and her mother, whom she calls Sister Hope. They're also friends of her family. And she mentions that various people showed up at the farm over the course of the summer to join the cooperative. She tells us about their values and provides, of course, a narrative of the year. The sad story is that the experiment fails by the end of the year. First, looking at the values, like Henry Thoreau, the experiment was committed to simplifying living. So they, for example, were committed to doing without many ordinary luxuries of 19th century life. They were committed to doing without a profit. In other words, the farm wouldn't make a profit. They were interested in earning just enough money to buy their basic needs, like Henry Thoreau. She mentions that they were committed to a vegetarian diet, and for them, that was a part of their profound belief that all forms of subjugation should end. Subjugation meaning, domination and oppression. For them, that includes not only human subjugation, but also the subjugation of animals. She mentions that the community was committed to following one's inner self or spirit. So in short, at this cooperative, you could do whatever you wanted to do, whatever you felt called to do. According to the story, they arrive in the countryside carrying a bust of Socrates, and they set up the farm, and her mother chooses to work in the house and is going to do some of the house work. That is perhaps her calling, and they begin to do some of the farming, and they have some interesting issues, like, for example, they don't want to use livestock to plow the land, but somebody brings some livestock and they end up using the livestock. At a certain point, some of the men decide they want to go out into the world and preach. Perhaps they were preaching the gospel. Perhaps they were preaching their ideas, for example, vegetarianism. So her father and his friend go off out of state and leave Sister Hope and the girls to maintain the farm. At a certain point, probably about November, a disagreement has formed between the father's friend, whom she calls Mr. Lion. Mr. Lion and Sister Hope don't get along, and so in November, Mr. Lion and his son leave the Fruitlands, and in the last pages, Louisa May describes the despair that overcomes her father and her mother's response to this despair. Okay, well, let's hear now some objections that are given in this document, and we can promote these objections as objections to the intellectual life proposed by Henry Thoreau and by Louisa May Alcott's father. The first objection is that the idealism of Louisa May's father was impractical, according to Louisa May. In particular, the idea of simplifying my living and doing without manure, or doing without livestock or certain kinds of farm implements became too impractical. The crops, in short, were unsuccessful. They weren't able to produce enough to make it through the winter. So, in short, for Louisa May, the intellectual life failed to translate into practice. Louisa May shows us a kind of important drama that happens at Fruitlands between her mother and Mr. Lion. Very early on in the story, Louisa May's mother clearly doesn't agree with some of the proposals to eliminate, for example, sugar from the diet. Louisa May's mother would like, to have treats for the children. And so Louisa May's mother increasingly feels excluded from the experiment. And this is important because, according to the leaders, her father and his friend Mr. Lion, it's important that everybody pursue their calling, that everybody pursue their spirit. And Louisa May's mother believes in raising the children and maintaining a good farmhouse. So when Mr. Lion tells Louisa May's mother, you can't have sugar, you can't have oil for your lamp, Louisa May's mother is very upset because she understands this is like hypocritical on their part. Similarly, the older men go off preaching, and they want to spread their ideas and share their ideas to the greater world. And Louisa May's mother and the children aren't included in these important duties. She calls them the great duties. And instead, Louisa May's mother and the children perform what she calls the small duties, washing the dishes, cleaning the clothes. So, in short, women weren't included in this intellectual life as it was put into practice. One third objection, I think, is a fun objection, perhaps a kind of joke on Louisa May Alcott's part. I call it the hot air balloon objection. This objection is stated by Louisa May in several documents, so I think this is perhaps her most important objection to the intellectual life, based upon her observations of her father over many years. She felt that an intellectual is somebody who's like a hot air balloon. who needs to be held down and grounded by his family and friends, lest he blow away. What does Louisa May mean by this? One thing she must mean by this observation is that a person who's committed to ideas, to philosophy and theology and book learnings, somebody that's very abstract and hard to relate to. So she mentions, she was once in a conference or a philosophical conversation conducted by her father, and she just couldn't follow anything he was saying. He's just too aloof and over her head, like a hot air balloon. Similarly, for Louisa May Alcott, her father was very much dependent upon his wife, whom she calls Sister Hope, and his daughters to maintain his home and to provide him food and to ground him on earth. It seems that Louisa May felt her father was taking this relationship for granted. And so she often, when she uses this hot air balloon metaphor, she describes herself and her mother holding a rope and holding her father down to earth while he pursues this intellectual life. In short, the intellectual life takes for granted relationships and dependencies that are nonetheless an important part of human life. Let's hear now what are some proposals that Louisa May Alcott must have about the good life, looking at Transcendental Wild Oats. First proposal is that Louisa May Alcott may believe in being practical. If we have ideas or principles, we ought to be able to put them into practice. If we can't put them into practice in the real world and in day-to-day life, then those ideas or principles aren't valuable. So we ought to be practical. On page 377, Louisa May says something very interesting. She says, this is toward the end of the story, we all make mistakes and experiences help to shape a life. This is a small statement. However, this is an important statement to examine, in particular the idea that experiences shape a life. We'll see this idea expressed again in hospital sketches. We ought to give it some thought. Finally, from Transcendental Wild Oats, it's evident that Louisa May Alcott thinks we ought to value our human relationships, in particular our dependencies on other persons. And this is the conclusion of Transcendental Wild Oats, where her father, after suffering despair, realizes that his family is the most important thing to him in addition to God. So her father decides to give up his mission and dreams and commit to taking care of his family. And Louisa May Alcott approves of this conversion.